Welcome back from our break, and let's carry on with the lesson. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to have a look at the sources of genetic variation. All right, so we have a look, we spoke about genetic evidence, and now we look at the genetic evidence and where variation comes from. All right, so the study of genetics deals with similarities and differences of related organisms. Okay, so we will find that there are some characteristics that are similar, but then there are obviously also those characteristics that are different. Okay, genetic evidence that organisms are closely related and are likely to have in common or have a common ancestor includes identical DNA structure, a similar sequence of the genes. So in other words, the order in which their genes are found, that would be similar. Similar portions of DNA with no function. So in other words, that junk DNA that we learnt about when we studied DNA, that doesn't actually code for a gene. So that would be, those portions of DNA would also then be similar. And then similar mutations. And particularly we look at mitochondrial DNA because it's very, very easy to see the mutations occur in mitochondrial DNA a lot quicker, and it's quite easy to see them. All right, so now let's see where does genetic variation come from? And all of these sources of variation you have actually studied earlier on in the year. Okay, so the different sources of genetic variation are the following. The first one is crossing over. And crossing over, we know, takes place during prophase 1. And only during prophase 1. So what happens here is your homologous chromosomes lie together next to each other, and then chromatids, non-sister chromatids, would cross over and they would exchange genetic material. So as soon as those chromosomes move apart, they already are not the same as they were when they started out. There's already genetic variation. So we've created genetic variation in crossing over. All right, then the second place where genetic variation would occur is when the chromosomes go and line up on the equator during metaphase. And in this phase of meiosis, they go and line up at the equator randomly. So in other words, there isn't a set pattern that they line up on. We don't have to have all the maternal chromosomes on one side and the paternal on the other. It's just random. And every single time that meiosis takes place, those chromosomes would randomly line up. So there's never ever the same sequence. And that also then creates genetic variation. All right, then we look at the next one, the next source of genetic variation, which is random fertilization. And that is when we have, when a cell undergoes meiosis, it's going to form 4 gametes. So any one of those 4 gametes can fertilize another gamete. So if this is sperm cells, any one of those 4 would then have the chance of fertilizing the ovum. So that is why we say we don't know which one. Okay, and remember there are thousands and thousands and thousands of sperm cells that are produced. So that is why we say that fertilization is random. And because of that randomness, it brings about genetic variation. Okay, the next source of genetic variation is random mating. So if we have a look in organisms in the natural world, not all organisms have partners that mate for life. Most organisms don't. And even if we have a look in the plant world, mating is random. So there isn't always the same mate. The mating partner is not always the same. And this then, because it's random, then also introduces genetic variation. All right, and then the last form, or the last source of genetic variation is mutations. And remember we said that we learned that mutations are a random change in the genetic structure of an organism. So again, we don't know what causes it, why it happens, when it happens. It just does happen. And it happens randomly. And because of that, the randomness of the mutations then also creates a source for genetic variation. So all of those then are the sources of genetic variation. Okay. Now we get different types of variation. If we have a look at characteristics, there are some characteristics that don't place individuals or organisms into specific categories. And they seem to have more a continuous variation between the different forms of in the variation. And that we then call continuous variation. Okay, and a very good example of this is when we have a look, and here's a diagram that shows you skin color. You can see of all these little girls, they all have various ranges, or there's a whole range of skin color, hair color, eye color, even their height. Okay, so a very good example of a characteristic that has continuous variation is height. And if we have a look at the definition of continuous variation, then it's those characteristics where there is a range of intermediate phenotypes. So in other words, we don't just see short and tall. We see some short and then some a little bit taller and then some a little bit taller than that and middle height and then some very tall. So there isn't just two categories or three categories, short, medium and tall. Okay, there is a variation between all of them. So there's a range of intermediate phenotypes. And remember, phenotype is our physical appearance. Okay, another type of variation is called discontinuous variation. And as soon as we see this first part, discontinuous, that means that it doesn't flow. There is no continuation. So that then gives us a hint as to what this type of variation is. And if we have a look at the definition, we see it's those characteristics that fall into distinct categories. So discontinuous variation is all those characteristics that we find that then make us specifically into different categories. And a very good example of that in humans is blood groups. So if we have a look at the diagram, we can see that we have 4 different blood groups. So we've got 4 blood groups here. We've got blood group A, blood group B, blood group AB, and blood group O. And so even though it's the same characteristic, it's blood, there is no continuous variation. You either have blood group A, or you have blood group B, or you have blood group AB, or you have blood group O. All right, so let's go back and have a look just to make sure the difference between continuous variation and discontinuous variation. Okay, so continuous variation, we said, is those characteristics where there's a range of intermediate phenotypes. So there's a continuation. All right, so if you have a look at height here, you can see these girls. Some of them are very short, and then there's one that might be a little bit taller, and they get taller and taller and taller, or even color of their hair. We might have very light hair, and so it gets darker as the continuum moves along. So that then doesn't put them into specific categories. Whereas if we have a look at discontinuous variation, it's those characteristics that place organisms into specific categories, like we see in blood groups. Another example would be birds of different colors, where you have green birds and blue birds and yellow birds. That would be an example of discontinuous variation where they are then placed in specific categories. Okay, so discontinuous variation then places organisms in distinct categories, as we can see here with the 4 different blood types that we find in human beings. Okay, and we've reached the end of our lesson for today, and we'll see you again next time.